The Holocaust Museum's recently published 2015 Bearing Witness report on Iraq provides a brilliant overview of the issues we will be wrestling with tonight. Along with my colleague Michael Kessler, the Berkley Center's managing director, I want to emphasize how honored Georgetown is to be the third partner in this effort. As a religious institution committed to interfaith understanding and to the pursuit of justice and the common good, Georgetown really welcomes this opportunity to participate in this important dialogue for the people of Iraq, the United States, and the world. It is now my pleasure to introduce Kim Lawton, who will provide more detail about our program and our distinguished speakers. Kim is managing editor and correspondent for the acclaimed PBS program, Religion and Ethics Newsweekly. A reporter, producer, writer, and editor, she's an expert on issues of religion, ethics, and culture, and a frequent commentator on outlets including MSNBC, CNN, and the BBC. Her articles have appeared in numerous publications, including the Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post. So thank you again for being with us this evening, and please join me in welcoming Kim Lawton and our panelists.
Everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming and being here tonight. As a journalist, I've had the privilege of speaking to some of the survivors of the atrocities we're going to be hearing about tonight. Christians, members of the ancient Yezidi minority, Shiite Muslims, and others who have suffered real suffering, families who've been displaced, children who've been traumatized, futures that are uncertain. And for me, it's their stories that really highlight the importance of the discussion that we're having here tonight. And we have a terrific panel that is going to help us think through some of these issues. Before I introduce them, let me give you a few words about what the format of what's going to happen tonight. Each of the panelists will have a set amount of time to give us some framing remarks from their various perspectives about the issue. I will be very rigid in keeping time so that we have time to do all of our discussion. After that, we'll have a discussion among ourselves, so to speak, that you can listen in on as the panelists engage with one another and I ask them questions. And of course, we will save time for your questions as well. When you came in, you were given an index card. Please feel free to write your questions on that card. Pass them to the outer aisles so people can collect them. And at the end of our program, we will take time for as many questions as we can. So thank you very much for all of that. Let me give you a brief introduction of everybody. You received a longer notation in your program. If I spent all the time talking about them, we wouldn't have time to talk about anything else because they have many credentials. But sitting right next to me is Cameron Hudson. He's director of the Center for Prevention of Genocide at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, where he previously also served as policy director there. Prior to that, he worked for the administration, dealing with issues around South Sudan and genocide in Darfur. Then we have Jeffrey Feldman, who's the Undersecretary General for Political Affairs at the United Nations, where he advises the Secretary General on global peace and security issues. Before joining the UN, he served for nearly 30 years in the US Foreign Service, focusing on the Middle East and Africa. We have Tom Malinowski, who's the Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Previously, he was the Washington Director for Human Rights Watch. He also served as Senior Director on the National Security Council at the White House during the Clinton administration. The Bill Clinton administration, that is. Susan Hayward is Director for Religion and Inclusive Societies for the United States Institute of Peace, where she focuses on the development of conflict prevention, resolution, and reconciliation programs that target the religious sector. She's co-editor of the book Women, Religion, and Peacebuilding, Illuminating the Unseen. And we have Mark Lagon. He's president of Freedom House, an independent watchdog group dedicated to the expansion of freedom and democracy around the world. He previously worked at Georgetown University's Foreign Service Program in the Council on Foreign Relations. He's also served as Ambassador at Large at the State Department, directing the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. So as you can tell, it's quite a stellar group. We're going to start with Cameron. As Tom noted, the Holocaust Museum put together a very great report. I highly recommend it, Bearing Witness to Genocide, based on travels to northern Iraq. So Cameron's going to give us a little overview of that report.
Thank you, Kim. Well, again, it's an honor to be here with a great group of panelists and three great organizations, I think, and a great crowd. So thank you all for being here. I think it's a testament to the importance of this issue. I think during my remarks and during, I think, some of the other remarks, we'll be showing some of the photos of the trip that we took late last year, and which my staff is on again this week and next week in Iraq. So, but I wanted to start out just and give a little bit of sort of historical footnote as to why the Holocaust Museum is engaged in the issue of religious freedom and the protection of persecuted groups in Iraq. And as I was thinking about the anniversary that the Berkley Center is celebrating, their 10th anniversary, it dawned on me that tomorrow is actually the 23rd anniversary of the opening of the Holocaust Museum in Washington. And part of the sort of founding lore of our museum is that our founding chairperson, Elie Wiesel, at the time, sort of chastised President Clinton at the opening because we were opening this memorial to the dead at a time when in Europe there was a war tearing apart the ethnic and religious fabric of the then Yugoslavia. And he called on those assembled and specifically to those of us at the museum that we should be more than a memorial to the dead, that we needed to be a living memorial, and that we needed to take very seriously this idea that, in his words, a memorial unresponsive to the future would violate the memory of the past. And so for us, 23 years after the Balkans, 70 years this year after the Nuremberg trials, I think this history remains incredibly relevant, and the reasons for us to engage in genocide prevention today, I think are all the more important as they were 20 years ago or 70 years ago. So I'm grateful for this opportunity to speak here tonight. You know, we took a trip last year in the fall of 2015 to the region because there had been claims of genocide. And as a genocide organization, I think there's nowhere in the world today where the claim and the assertion of genocide rings more true than in Iraq. And I want to start us off with just a short video that we brought back from our trip to Iraq, because in our experience, the words of the survivors and the words of the people who've experienced these crimes is far more resonant than anything that I can convey. So I wanted to just start with a quick video, if I could.
My family now, my mom and my first wife and my sister and my son, we don't know anything about. No telephone, nobody said where they are. It's been missing. I want to tell my son, where are you? I miss you. If you're alive, just to contact us. Where you mom? Where's you the grandmother? Where's your sister? Where's you all the people in the culture? If you know anything about, just give me a message. We just stay. I don't know what we think. Some maybe come back. We think I don't know. You don't know today and tomorrow what happened. Most heart we don't know anything about Kurdistan. No like guarantee here. No power, you know. Water didn't have. Help didn't have. You must pay money. Everywhere money. Everywhere you go, you must pay money. And these people didn't have any money. Everybody go out like just clothes. From culture, nobody get it anything. Only the clothes. It's very hard situation. Yeah. About 1,700. Maybe only 700 left now in here. The other one is been missing. Nobody. You don't know where they are.
So Khalif was living in New Zealand, actually, when the Islamic State in the summer of 2014 started their assault on the northern part of Iraq, in the area essentially between Erbil, Duhok, and Mosul, you see on the map. And the story that he describes of his family is really a story that's now been told 800,000 times over. I think you heard that number already. in the span of about 100 days in the summer of 2014, more than 800,000, nearly a million, displaced from their homes by the Islamic State. And what you heard from Khalif was that the movement of the Islamic State was so fast and took so many by surprise, I think, from policymakers in Washington and New York to average citizens and civilians on the ground, that people left with the clothes on their back and the money in their pockets, and it's left them incredibly vulnerable as the months and now years have worn on in their displacement. But importantly, I think it's important to focus on this region of Nineveh. This is the sort of northern region of Iraq where we visited and conducted most of our investigations, to understand sort of the fragility of this population, or these populations, and this region as a whole. Just to give you some context, Iraq has about 10% of its population which are which identify as ethnic or religious minorities. Of that 10%, so about 3 million people, more than 80% of them are in this very small region of northern Iraq. And they've been there for millennia. They've been there since Old Testament and prior to. So an incredibly ancient community of people really tied to this area. And so they were, in some ways, very, very much a ripe and vulnerable population for the acts of the Islamic State, and for them to carry out a sort of ideology, which I think we'll get into a bit later. But in terms of the communities that we saw, Yezidis, of course, have been referenced. Shia Shabak, Assyrian Christian. Here's an Assyrian Christian man who we interviewed, who had fled and joined the Kurdish Peshmerga. Iraq is bordering, or rather this region of Nineveh borders, sort of is, the region of Kurdistan sort of has some an autonomous region of Kurdistan neighboring Iraq. And so there's some dispute right now, and has been, and certainly during the period of violence, there was a bit of a dispute between Kurdish officials and Iraqi officials of who really had authority over this region, and whose responsibility was to secure the region and to protect it from the onslaught as ISIS swept through the region, destroying, as has been said, shrines, temples, and churches. Really, I think, making very clear in this period of time not only their capability to destroy these, but really their intent and their ideological intent. Many of the people that we interviewed and met with over the course of our visit heard the propaganda, saw the propaganda that ISIS was promulgating in the region, that they were devil worshippers, that they were infidels, that they were apostates, and that the Islamic State had not only an interest in their destruction, but they had a responsibility to destroy these groups. And so, again, as a sort of genocide organization, this, I think, fit very clearly into that very specific definition of genocide, which requires that a group demonstrate its intent to destroy these groups. And so, as we traveled around this region of Kurdistan, we were in a variety of the displaced persons camps. Here's one that we were in outside of Erbil, where now the vast majority of this region is living. In these camps, we documented what we can term as forced displacement, forced religious conversion, rape, torture, kidnapping, sexual enslavement, and murder on a massive scale. We heard many stories. One in particular sticks out, of a elementary school principal who had no notice that Islamic State militants were entering their village, and came into the school and separated the school among boys and girls. The boys were loaded onto buses. This was 2 years ago. They have not been heard from since. Most of the girls, they believe, have been sold into some sort of slavery or bondage. This was an entire elementary school essentially erased from existence, and the principal oversaw it as not as a perpetrator, mind you, but as a witness to this crime. I want to give a postscript to Khalif's story, because we've been in touch with Khalif in the video that you saw since. And Islamic State militants have reached out to him and told him that they have his wife and that for $20,000 he can buy her freedom. And so this is the situation that, that the residents of these camps find themselves in right now. And so I think the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what can we do about it? And what are the next steps? The administration in the last
ليس
month...
لدينا حلولا إلا أن يكون لنا منطقة آمنة في سهل نينوى، أنه لم يعد لنا أي ثقة بأي قوة يمكن لها أن تحمي مناطقنا، لأنه حقيقة في وقت الأزمة في وقت الشدة لم يقم أحد بحمايتنا. لذلك اليوم أحد الشروط التي نريدها لعودتنا إلى مناطقنا هي أولاً الحماية الدولية، ثانياً أن تقوم الدولة بمحاسبة من تسبب في هذه الأحداث.
So this gentleman, I think, kind of frames very well what we heard in the camps, this idea of we want protection, we want to be able to return to our homes, but we can't do that without real physical protection. So I think there's a question for us is, how do we provide that? How do the Iraqis provide that? Or how do we assist them in the provision of that protection? And then secondly, how do we achieve justice? And I think this is, a central question around this issue. Because, again, from the genocide prevention perspective, justice is a cornerstone of how we respond to genocide, whether it's Nuremberg after the Holocaust or Cambodia, Rwanda, Yugoslavia. Justice is a central response to genocide. But when faced with a terrorist threat, justice is not meted out generally in the courtroom. It's meted out on the battlefield. And so the question that we have is defeating ISIS enough to protect civilians? Must we have a policy that also pursues the protection of civilians at the same time that we pursue a counterterrorism policy in Iraq? And I think until we can reconcile these seemingly opposing, but I don't believe that they are, policy approaches to the Islamic State, I think victims and survivors like you've seen here will continue to feel the threat of returning home and will likely not.
Thank you. And we can pursue some more of that later on. Jeffrey Feldman.
Thank you. Again, thanks to the three partners for inviting us all here for this really important topic, and I want to recognize in particular the contributions that the Holocaust Memorial Museum made with its Bearing Witness report and the research. Certainly the incredible suffering that the Iraqi ethnic and religious communities have suffered at the hands of ISIS has been a preoccupation of the Secretary General himself and of the United Nations system more generally. I think it's worth remembering that traditionally Iraq has been one of the most diverse countries in the Middle East. And that unique legacy of ethnic and religious diversity has encountered many strains over the centuries. Strains before 2003 with Anfal and the Kurds, after 2003. But now we're in a different situation where that ethno-religious diversity is at risk of being just wiped off the map by the type of activities that ISIL-Daesh is taking. And we know, all of us know a lot about the atrocities that ISIL has committed. Not only from the news, not only from research such as what the Holocaust Memorial Museum has done, but because ISIS itself brags about it. That they themselves put this out. And their clear policy, as Cameron has said, has been to suppress, to destroy, to expel all of these ethno-religious minority communities in Iraq, and to destroy the cultural and historic heritage that comes with them. Cameron, your report talks a lot about what happened in 2014 when the Christians had just very little notice in Mosul of whether they were going to have to pay the Islamic jizya tax, convert, or expel. In the end, they virtually left in mass. They're still in the IDP camps that you've shown us pictures of. And I think we at the UN would agree with your report's conclusion that while the suffering has been tremendous across the board, that no single community has suffered as much as the Yazidis have suffered. thousands of Yazidi men and boys summarily executed and their bodies dumped in mass graves, women and girls being used as sexual slaves, being trafficked. I mean, there's a clear policy of ISIL to be using sexual slavery, trafficking in persons as tools of the terrorism that they are committing, and we estimate, without great statistics, we estimate that ISIL Daesh is still holding at least 3,500 Iraqis, mostly women and girls, but also some men, mostly Yazidis, but also Turkoman and Mandean Sabians and Shabak, others as well. And in 2014, the United Nations Human Rights Council sent a fact-finding mission. And the fact-finding mission concluded that subject to determination by an independent competent court, because the documentation is important here, members of ISIL may have perpetrated genocide and may have committed crimes against humanity and war crimes. This was published in March 2015 by the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. It's very much in line with the report and with your remarks, Cameron. Adam Dieng is the Secretary General's advisor on the prevention of genocide. And he's always very careful about using that term. He doesn't want it to be used for just regular oppression, if you can call it that, or human rights violations more generally. And he came back from a trip last year, and again, emphasizing that documentation is needed, but saying that this is a case where in his view, probably the documentation would back up the use of this word. Now, the suffering of the victims of ISIL isn't just when they've been expelled, isn't just when they've been held. After people have escaped, there's a real need for psychosocial and medical services. There's a real need for jobs, for health, education, things like that, and it's very, very difficult. There's right now very little prospect for return to these areas, which is, as Cameron said, is the goal of most people. But we're talking about long-term displacement and the need for real services to help the people who have either fled or who have escaped. I mean, women and children who have been subjected to sexual violence, slavery, and torture, of course, remain deeply, deeply traumatized. And the access to the type of care they need is very, very limited. There's also the problem of intercommunal relations that are strained more generally in Iraq. We read a lot, we hear a lot, we see a lot of evidence of the Sunni-Shia cleavages in the broader Middle East, especially in Iraq. And that's the ethno-sectarian distrust that has always been there but has been deepened by what's happened, makes the reintegration that much more difficult. There's long-term discrimination that we need to address as part of the healing mechanisms to ISIL. And this bleak situation has forced many people to leave the country, even though their primary goal is to go back to their original communities. There are many, many rifts in Iraqi society, and the country's prospects of emerging from this as a multi-ethnic, multi-confessional, and multicultural democracy built on the rule of law and respect for human rights depends on the ability of the Iraqis to heal these rifts. Now, the fight against the violent extremism, the fight against ISIL, is but one part of what needs to be done. There's also needs to be a focus on prevention. It goes back to what I was just talking about the distrust, the discrimination, long-term feelings of marginalization by some of these communities. So what we in the United Nations are trying to do, among other things, is find ways to promote trust building as something that's more critical now than it's ever been. There needs to be sort of an inclusive reconciliation process at all levels of Iraqi society, which isn't really happening very well. Those of you that follow Iraq know that right now the Iraqi parliament is in the middle of a big political debate over whether they've thrown out the speaker legally or not, and what they're going to do with the prime minister's proposal for a new cabinet. This is not addressing the sorts of issues that are going to allow these religious and ethnic minorities to resume their lives. And accountability is something we feel very, very strongly about the United Nations. Cameron is absolutely right. And the first responsibility rests with the government of Iraq. You know, they should be using judicial systems, perhaps setting up special courts up to international standards. We're also encouraging them to consider seriously becoming a party to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, given the sorts of crimes that are being committed in Iraq. We're also very much involved in trying to provide protection and assistance to the survivors of ISIL's violence. The UN's Population Fund has provided psychosocial and medical services to 125,000 women from minority communities. We've been working on capacity building programs to help Iraqis have the skills to deal with the traumatized victims of this. But I have to say, it's really hard right now in the United Nations to raise money for these sorts of activities. This is not something that comes out of the regular budget. These are things that countries provide voluntary contributions for. The United Nations has asked for $861 million for the humanitarian efforts in Iraq this year. $861 million to do things like the psychosocial services. And it's been 16% funded. We have 16% of what we estimated that we needed. We're also working in that same line of reconciliation through our mission in Iraq, the United Nations Assistance Mission to Iraq, with the Department of Political Affairs that I head, on engaging community leaders at the community level on how to accept survivors of the type of atrocities that we're describing, how to integrate people and protect the minorities at the community level. We're also advising the Iraqis on legislation that needs to be passed, basic legislation on things that would safeguard the rights of citizens before the law, guarantee the safe return of displaced citizens irrespective of their communities, promoting the rebuilding of ties, as difficult as they may be above Iraq's diverse community. There's a lot of international attention being paid to this. I don't want to overstate the impact. It's good that the attention's being paid, but it needs to have a practical impact on the ground. So we're trying to translate international conferences, international attention into practical, on the ground programs that can actually help protect victims, let them reintegrate them into their lives. Now, winning the war against ISIL is fundamental to being able to allow the Iraqi communities to rebuild. But as despicable as ISIL is, we can't focus all of our attention only on ISIL. First, if we focus entirely on ISIL, we'd be validating the propaganda that the group itself sets out. But second, it would also let off the hook too many others who bear some responsibility for the divisions, the discrimination that has existed in the Middle East and has affected the condition of minorities in the Middle East. So we need to be looking at basic human rights principles, at fundamental international norms and international humanitarian law, both in fighting ISIL and in talking with others about how we best defend minorities throughout Iraq and the region. Sustainable peace in Iraq has to be built on an inclusive, fair, and equal treatment of all Iraqis. Thank you.
Thank you. Tom Malinowski.
Thank you, everybody, and thanks again for having me and for the work, particularly that the memorial has done on this issue. I'm going to follow Jeff, and I'm going to actually say a lot of the things that he said from my perspective as a State Department official. Number one, the folks whose voices you heard on those videos, the people who have been subjected to this unbearable suffering at the hands of ISIS, or Daesh as we like to call them at the State Department, deserve to be protected. That is a moral issue for most of us. It's a moral imperative, we feel, as a country that has been involved in the Middle East to try to do what we can to give them the protection that they deserve as people, as individuals. But there's something else here that I think is important to protect, and that is an idea, a tradition, that people who are different, people who have different faiths and beliefs and cultures and ethnicities can live together and in fact should live together, that our lives are richer, that our societies are more creative and more productive when different people live together. And support for that idea, as we can see all over the world right now, in Europe, even here in the United States, is very, very fragile. Perhaps it's always been very fragile. It's something that has to be constantly defended again and again and again. And in no part of the world has it been more fragile recently than the Middle East. In fact, a large part of the Middle East that we know today has been essentially homogenized by wars and conflicts and upheavals over the last several decades. This region has somehow managed to remain diverse and interesting in remarkable ways. I've never been to Iraq or Syria until just a few years ago, mostly in this job. And I have to say, I was just amazed and fascinated by getting to know this part of the Middle East, northern Iraq in particular, and parts of Syria, where all of these different ancient communities have managed to survive for so long. And I think ancient is the word that comes to us whenever we actually meet them, because they're not just that, the Christian communities are not just Christians. They look and sound and live in many ways like the Christian communities we imagine from biblical times. There are ethnic and religious communities there who I'd never heard of until I became an assistant secretary of state. I must admit, never heard of the Yezidis, or the Sabian Mandeans, or the Kakais, or the Shabak minority, or known their history or how they've interacted with each other in the past. And it is actually a wonderful, wonderful and important thing to preserve. And as Jeff said, although they have suffered many, many upheavals and threats over the years, the threat from Daesh is like nothing else that they have suffered, because here we have an organization that knows no limits to its behavior, that is absolutely committed to eliminating these people from the face of the earth, that brags about it, that advertises its atrocities against them rather than tries to hide them. Now, we felt at the State Department, and Secretary Kerry in particular felt that when something like this happens, it is important to call it by its name. And so his decision earlier this year to declare formally that what has been happening to a number of the groups, including the Yazidis, the Christians, and some of the Shia Muslim groups, is genocide, was meant to offer that recognition. And we'd heard from many representatives of these communities that simply offering that recognition of what had happened to them was very, very important to them. But it's not an easy process in our bureaucracy to come to that kind of determination. It is a legal determination. It probably took more lawyers than can fit in this room to sift through all the evidence and the facts and to argue out the case, to figure out, was there intent to eliminate them, and do the actions merit that the use of this term, which we've hardly ever used in our history, and generally by the time the lawyers can figure out what to call the crime, it's too late to do something about it. And so our main focus has been the doing something about it. Now, what have we tried to do? I think first, it's important to remember that the first shots the United States fired in the fight against Daesh were fired to defend Yazidis who were driven from their home home city of Sinjar in northern Iraq by the advancing Daesh forces, who'd fled from that town up a mountain that happens to be very sacred to them, Mount Sinjar, and found themselves surrounded on all sides by people who were set on killing them. Thousands of people climbed that mountain. And when they got there, they got on their cell phones and they started calling people. They started calling their relatives in the United States, their very few friends in the US government who'd known them from having served in Iraq, many of whom worked in my bureau, coincidentally. And so here I am sitting at my desk learning about the existence of the Yezidi people from this crisis, and we're trying to figure out what to do. And within days, we managed, through literally talking to these people on the mountain on their cell phones, figure out a way to try to airdrop humanitarian supplies, and then ultimately help direct our military to conduct the strikes that were needed to enable the rescue of those people from that mountain. Since then, we've done that sort of thing several more times. We've done it when Christian communities were besieged by ISIL in northern Syria, several Shia communities in Iraq. We've provided up almost $1 billion of humanitarian aid to help the victims of this crisis. We have provided support to document the abuses for a future, hopefully, accountability process, to protect mass graves, to provide direct support to some of the victims, including the psychosocial support that women in particular who have escaped ISIL captivity need. A number of these minority communities have begun to form armed militias of their own. This is a fraught issue in Iraq. We have insisted that militia groups be formed and operate under the operational control of the Iraqi government or the Kurdish authorities. But where minority communities in this area have done it in that way, we have begun to work with them. So there's a lot that we have done, and it is not nearly enough. We have to be honest about that, because the really big challenge lies ahead. The really big question is, will these people be able to survive on their land? Will they be able to return to land that is not yet liberated from the terrorists? Now, what do we need to do to get there? Defeating Daesh militarily is in many ways the easy part. It'll take time, but we know how to do it, and we know that we are going to do it. The important question is, how do you rebuild safety for the people who lived in these areas? How do you create a set of institutions and structures that enable them to feel like they can go back and this is not going to happen to them again and again and again from the next iteration of Daesh? And they're really complicated and tough challenges, including the issue of revenge against the people who they perceived did this to them. I was, a couple of months ago, in northern Iraq, and we went up to the main Yezidi shrine in a place called Lalish and spent hours talking to the leaders of the Yezidi community about everything that they were facing. And I brought up this issue because we have had Yazidis going back to Sunni areas and looting and in some cases killing people who they perceived as having committed crimes against them. And they looked me in the eye and they said, well, what do we do? Tell us what to do when our people go back to a village and 2 kilometers away, there's another village full of people who we know were responsible for the rape and murder of members of our families. How can we live there with those people next door? And nobody else is doing anything about it. And so realistically, we're going to have to provide an answer for those people, an answer that involves a justice process, a local justice process, a lot of support for rebuilding and reconstruction, a lot of support for their security, which unfortunately from their point of view is not going to come from some international army. And we are going to have to face these tests relatively soon, because the biggest and most challenging part of the military campaign against Daesh is around the corner. It'll be the liberation of the Iraqi city of Mosul. There have been a number of areas liberated from Daesh in the last year. None of them compared to this. There are 2 million civilians living in Mosul. And the Ninewa province, where most of these minorities lived, is this part of Iraq. So how this is done, how successfully this is done, and the extent to which we are able to follow through on the military mission with stabilization and support for these communities is going to be the thing that determines whether religious minorities can survive in northern Iraq. There were a lot of folks who lobbied us very, very hard to say that what was happening was genocide. And they were right to do so. But that was the easy part. Calling this by its name was the easy part. And I hope that all of those people, including folks in the Congress who control our purse strings, who were pushing us hard to call this by this name, now will recognize that they have a responsibility to support the very expensive effort that will be required, working with the UN and humanitarian actors on the ground and local authorities to make sure that when Daesh is defeated, there is hope for these people who are driven out of their homes to return and to survive on their land. Thank you.
Thank you. And that's a great segue for Susan.
Thank you, Kim, and to Charles, and to Tom, and to everybody for inviting me here today, and to thank you to all of you for coming out tonight to witness to this and to talk about this very important issue. There are, as my colleagues have already said, there are literally millions of horror stories that we could tell about what's taking place in Iraq and in the region. There's the 3.4 horror stories of those who've been displaced. There's also the horror stories of those who aren't counted among those numbers but have been displaced or who've been disappeared. There's the atrocious stories that we have been hearing of the minority communities, the Christians, the Yezidis, the Shabak, the Sabians, and so on. And there's also the horror stories of the Shia, the Sunni Muslims who have also been attacked by Daesh and others who are seeking to survive in the midst of this horrible situation. Of course, the number of horror stories is disproportionately being faced by the minority communities, and because of the targeted attacks of Daesh, but also because of the soil that my colleagues have already made reference to that existed in Iraq prior to the rise of Daesh. I worked in Iraq from about 2007 to 2010, and even during that time, Daesh wasn't on the scene yet, but even during that time, there were already lots of horror stories. There were already a lot of displaced population amongst the minority communities. There were already many minority communities who felt they had to flee because they were under attack, because they felt particularly vulnerable in the midst of the turmoil that was going on. They didn't feel that they could depend on either the security sector from the Kurdish regional government nor from the government in Baghdad, because of what was already said by one of my colleagues, that these governments themselves were in dispute about which territory they controlled, trying to claim that territory. But in the midst of that meant that they didn't necessarily feel accountability to protecting the populations in the midst of that dispute. And so as a result, these minority communities were already feeling quite a bit of threat, quite a bit of vulnerability. Then when Daesh came in, the soil was there for the fertile ground for this kind of genocidal action that's taking place. And then in addition to the horror stories that are being faced by individuals and communities, there's of course the horror stories of cultural genocide. We're at the Religious Freedom Center right now, and as Jeff said, there's this being a location of such great diversity. There are stories going way back into ancient times of conflict and strife and massacres between religious communities. But there are also stories of incredible religious diversity, religious pluralism, religious coexistence, some of the earliest stories of religious freedom as we might understand it in modern human rights language that existed in Babylon and in Mesopotamia by leaders like Cyrus and so on that we can read in biblical stories itself. So there is this, there is a bit of fertility in that ground too for that kind of religious diversity and the ability of these kinds of ancient traditions to survive against all these odds for millennia. So there's the tragedy as well, not just of the human story, but also the story of religious sites, religious practices, ancient cultural traditions being destroyed or wiped out. And the question of how do we not just preserve, but revive and allow those traditions to thrive under this current situation, or in the future as more areas become liberated, either in Iraq or in exile. If communities choose to stay in exile, how do they continue to preserve and allow to thrive some of these ancient traditions? While, of course, as Tom already said, while the tide might be turning against Daesh, more areas being liberated, the work to build peace is going to take quite a long time because of these concerns about security, the lack of faith in the security sector, the sense of injustice and the need for reconciliation, the extraordinary needs in terms of rehabilitation, but also the fears that as these areas are liberated, there remains in Iraq many underlying sectarian, communal tensions, political conflicts, and so on, that in the vacuum that's created within these liberated areas, there's still the potential for things to devolve into civil war. And then on top of all of this, we also have, there's not just the atrocities that have been committed by Daesh, which are extraordinary, but there's also the infrastructure that's been destroyed, the displacement, the loss that's occurred because of, as well, the military efforts to destroy Daesh, which, though just, if even any war, even when it's just, still causes suffering and loss and destruction of infrastructure that needs to be rebuilt. And so those will also be some of the needs. But I wanted to, without downplaying any of these horror stories that we've been hearing, and with gratitude for the illustrations that we're seeing and the voices that we are hearing, because not only do these communities deserve to be protected, but they deserve to be heard. And so thank you to all of you and to the Holocaust Museum for sharing some of these voices with us and allowing them to tell their stories to us. I also want to lift up some stories of hope from this area, because I think after witnessing all of these horror stories, what we need, in understanding them and understanding the depth of it, the next thing we need to do is see where there are glimmers of where we can draw our attention to and offer some support in order to begin this process of rebuilding and reconciliation. So a few things I want to highlight. One is I want to tell the story of an alliance of Iraqi minority organizations that arose in 2011 and has continued to work tirelessly even in the midst of all of this loss. It's a group that in many places, not just in Iraq, when there are situations of insecurity and violence, there also become strains within and between different ethnic and religious communities. And the minority communities in Iraq are just like other minorities in community Iraq. They experience too some of these strains and tensions between them as they seek to vie for resources, to get protection from the government and so on. But the inability of the minority community, or the lack of really robust engagement and cooperation between minority communities, and the means by which those relationships get strained in the midst of insecurity, has made it difficult for them to do advocacy, to do support and humanitarian relief for some of those organizations at times when they need it most. In some cases, this isn't a generalization, but this has been a trend that has been seen in Iraq. So the alliance was created in order to try to bring a lot of these organizations together so that they could more effectively advocate for the minority communities as a whole. And they have been able to ensure greater protection for minority rights legislation within the Kurdish regional government, within the draft constitution. They've been able to better document and draw attention to the atrocities that happened in Sinjar against the Yezidi community and draw international attention to it as a whole. They have been able to draw resources to the extent that they're able from the Iraqi government and from the Kurdish regional government for their communities to offer some support. Not enough, but the fact that they're able to do this advocacy together has made their efforts more effective. Secondly is some of the work that's being done to facilitate discussions between displaced populations who want to return to the areas that have been liberated and the security actors for whom they don't have much trust, as Tom was saying. And in order for them to begin to have trust, of course, they need to see that efforts are being taken to ensure their security, but there also needs to, for that to happen, there needs to be some conversation that's happening between them as well, in order for those security actors to understand what their needs are, for those communities to feel heard by government authorities and the security actors, and for some assurance to be in place that if they return, that some of their needs will be met. So some of these facilitated dialogues between the security and the government actors and the minority communities are taking place in the northern area across Iraq to try to facilitate rebuilding this trust within the security sector. And then thirdly, I want to highlight some efforts that are being done not just within the minority community, but also within the majority Sunni community. Because as we all know, in order for minority rights to be protected, in order for minority communities to thrive, that needs to be the responsibility, and it requires the action, not just of minority communities, but also of majority communities. So I want to tell two stories, and one is of an Iraqi Sunni. His name is Abdulaziz, and we at USIP have supported him and worked with him for many years. He lived in Mosul. He fled before Daesh came in, but he still goes back and forth between where he's living in Amman in displacement and goes back and forth to the northern region in Iraq in order to serve as a peace builder. And he has, for years in particular, done a lot of work in the Ninewa province to try to bring together, when there has been issues of conflict or strife or strain, particularly amongst minority communities, to try to serve as a facilitator of dialogue and conflict prevention. For example, between the Christian and the Shabak community. I see it. And his efforts to try to serve as a neutral mediator, but also to try to serve as a face and an action of Sunni Muslim advocating for and supporting peace amongst and protection of the minority communities is extraordinary. The second Muslim peace builder I want to acknowledge is Sheikh Abdallah Bambaya, who's not himself Iraqi, he's Mauritanian, but he has done a lot of efforts to try to advance Islamic support for the protection of minority rights for those who are living in Muslim majority countries as an Islamic duty. So how many of you have heard of the Marrakesh Declaration? Can you raise your hand? Got a sprinkling here, that's good. And of course, Sheikh Bambaya was just honored here a couple nights ago at the Religious Freedom Center. But the Marrakesh Declaration, he is a very prominent Sunni scholar with a lot of legitimacy and authority. And the Marrakesh Declaration came out in January of this year, which brought together hundreds of Muslim scholars to declare protection of religious minorities as an Islamic duty, drawing from the Charter of Medina, from very historic and authoritative texts and teachings and jurisprudence within Islam, and bringing that into conversation with international human rights law in a way that's brilliant in terms of Islamic scholarship. Now, the declaration itself, there's many of these kinds of declarations, and I know as Americans we often ask, okay, so what? How is the rubber actually going to meet the road? And he is now pursuing actions in order to allow this declaration and support this declaration being used as a tool for advocacy to hold governments accountable, as a tool of education to try to kind of inculcate and spread this understanding and this commitment to protecting religious diversity as an Islamic call. Now, these are just a few stories, and there's many more. One I would have liked to tell that maybe I can
I'll
in the
give you a
discussion.
chance later.
Okay. Is of the work that Yezidi clergy are doing as well. And of course, many of these are very long-term needs, and they don't, the horror stories in some way trump these. But as I said, I think seeing and understanding where there are some of these positive efforts taking place begins to give us a sense of where do we go now? What can we do to try to address this huge problem?
Thank you. Mark, baton cleanup.
Thank you, Kim, and I'm also pleased at our three hosts bringing us together, and thank you all for attending and your interest. I'd like to offer a little bit of a larger context, sort of widening the aperture of the lens here and picking up on some of the observations of Undersecretary General Feltman, who I have really high regard for from knowing him from the State Department. Look, rights violations against religious minorities are an ongoing concern in Iraq. This is not a past tense matter. It's a large and ongoing question. And it's a problem in the surrounding region. Civil conflict and the rise of ISIS have increased attacks on religious groups, but let's not forget the ongoing pattern in the region of it. Violations are consistently the most egregious in those areas that are under control of ISIS. They occur throughout the region of the Middle East and North Africa, and often at the hands of government actors. It's a great observation, as I was talking to Cameron about, that atrocities can come at the hands of non-state actors, but let's remember those dominant government actors committing atrocities and human rights abuses. As governments and opposition groups vying for power frequently wage their battles on religious grounds, civilians with absolutely no role in the conflict end up getting targeted based on who they are, their faith. In Iraq, religious persecution is fueled by decades of sect-centric politics. We've heard about Saddam Hussein earlier among the panelists. It continued under the Shia-dominated governments in power since 2004. While ISIS has escalated atrocities, religious minorities have also suffered as religious groups have ended up retaliating against ISIS actions. The Yezidi militia carried out a massacre of 21 Sunni villagers in June of 2015. Shia militias have indiscriminately attacked Sunni mosques, religious leaders, and civilians. Take, for example, after the retaking of the city of Tikrit from ISIS in April of last year, Shiite militiamen burned down hundreds of homes. They looted stores, and they brutally murdered their enemies, including dragging a corpse through the streets and slitting the throat of a suspected ISIS fighter in front of foreign reporters. In addition, members of different religious minorities, particularly Christians, face persecution from their neighbors. For instance, Christians from areas where ISIS have been defeated remain unable to return to their homes. Those homes were confiscated by non-Christian social actors. In the wider region, think on the one hand about countries with authoritarian central governments and on the other countries with weak central governments. Those countries with the authoritarian central governments, they see religious persecution mostly carried out by the governmental actors. In the cases of the countries with the weak governmental authorities or warfare, it's the non-state actors like ISIS that are the most often responsible for the religious persecution. I share this kind of broader perspective because the meat and potatoes of what Freedom House offers are annual assessments of human rights, civil liberties, press freedoms, and internet freedom around the world. We're the context guys. In Syria, ISIS has imposed an ideology by force in the areas it controls. The Alawite government has increasingly targeted Sunnis, whose religion is often seen as a proxy for government opposition. Freedom of religion is relatively better in the rebel-held areas of Syria. If you take Bahrain, nearby, where Tom was telling us he's just recently returned from, Shiites have faced increased harassment since the uprising in Bahrain in 2011, which initially was aimed at greater political freedoms for Shiites. Members of the country's Shia Muslim majority in Iran, who don't abide by the state's version of Islam, are subject to detention, prosecution, and imprisonment, especially the Baha'i. Iranian Christians, particularly converts from Islam, face similar pressures based on their religious identity. Now, Saudi Arabia, which, if I'm cheerfully repeating themes in my tenure as president of Freedom House, I continue to ask, is this really a worthy ally of the United States? The Saudi government continues to see its Shia Muslim population as a tool in the hands of the Iranian government for creating unrest in the kingdom. Shia Muslims who advocate for equal treatment regularly face arrest, detention, and sustained persecution. Elsewhere in the region, in Egypt, attacks against Egyptian Copts continue to be widespread. These include forced displacement, bomb attacks, arson, and the blocking of church construction. And I never fail to hear about this from the head of our religious freedom program at Freedom House, who is an Egyptian Copt. Shiite activists in Egypt have also been regularly targeted. So the reason I back up on this is not to conflate atrocities with regular order religious persecution, but to remind you that there is no such thing as regular order religious persecution. It is a pattern of treating groups of human beings as less than human. ISIS is in a category of atrocities, and it has to be subject to a particular high-level matter of witness, documentation, and accountability. It strikes home what Tom says about the easy part is the gaggle of lawyers called upon to make a decision whether the G word, genocide, is going to be invoked. I recall it well when Secretary of State Powell testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that genocide had occurred in Darfur. And yet action is what's the issue, accountability. It is the most bloodthirsty and inhumane form of religious persecution in the Middle East and North Africa that has come from ISIS. And let's not forget that the efforts of terrorists are by nature to target the innocent. In this case, it's a couple levels up from what we think of normally of terrorists, when the goal is the annihilation of particular groups, and a form of particularly atrocious sadism. But while we look at ISIS, let me conclude by emphasizing the root cause of the crisis here are atrocities committed by a government, by Assad's government. And the international community, as a combination of perhaps an overreach of one presidential administration's efforts in Iraq, and perhaps the underreach of another presidential administration's efforts in Syria, have allowed that root cause to fester. We would not have the ISIS problem we have today if that driver of a government-led atrocities effort had not been festering. And the United States is not alone in this effort. Other Western countries have too dawdled. There's a broader pattern that is worth remembering, despite these atrocities of ISIS and the root cause of Assad. A broader pattern of religious persecution throughout the region, and is absolutely imperative to remember that religious persecution is often brought about by governments, and governments considered U.S. allies in good standing. They aren't. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to everybody. That was a great beginning. Thank you. As I said, we're going to take a few minutes right now and dig a little deeper into some of the issues that all of my colleagues have raised. While we're doing that, I'd like to encourage you to think about questions you may have that we haven't gotten to, that we haven't addressed. So again, please write those questions down on the cards. Pass your cards down to the farthest ends of the aisles, and someone will collect them, and we'll have a chance to ask them in a few minutes. I'd like to encourage the panelists to jump in. I may call on individuals, but please don't wait to be called on. Feel free to jump in. If you'd like to respond to something somebody else said, let me know that as well. Let me just get this started by, let's talk about the issue of accountability. Several of you raised the issue of justice, accountability, that somebody needs to pay, quote unquote, or some kind of justice needs to be achieved. When you're dealing with a non-state actor like ISIS, how does that happen? There's not the usual pattern, and would that in some way even legitimize them as a state if we try to hold them accountable in some way? I don't know, Tom?
Oh, I don't think it would legitimize them. I always think that when you can capture somebody like the men who lead ISIS or Al-Qaeda, and instead of treating them like warriors or something special, you force them to line up in front of a judge in an ordinary courtroom next to the rapist and the mugger and the embezzler and say, take your turn and wait for your life sentence, that actually takes them down several notches, while at the same time emphasizing what makes us different from them. So,
What court? Is that an Iraqi court?
well, this is, I'm starting with the philosophical principle. In practice, I think with this organization, I don't expect that we will have that opportunity with respect to, say, the leader of Daesh, Baghdadi. I mean, if we're lucky, we'll capture him, but my guess is that his end will be on the quote-unquote battlefield. So, one can think about justice mechanisms, the ICC, some kind of high-level tribunal to deal with the leaders of this terrorist organization, and we should be thinking about that. But I don't think that's the central question. I think the central justice question gets back to the story I told about the Yezidis who asked me, what do we do when we go home and there are men in a village 3 kilometers away who collaborated in our eyes? They're not the leaders of terrorist organization. They're Sunni men who, when Daesh came, they, either out of fear or opportunism or maybe even genuine sincere belief in some cases, pointed out, okay, this is where the Yezidi house is, and maybe took that house and the property of the victims after they were driven from their homes. And there's got to be some answer for that problem if people are ever going to be able to live together again. And we hope that that answer is not the Yazidis killing their neighbors in revenge, or the Christians, or Shia, or others. And that has to be done locally. That's going to have to be Iraqi and Kurdish institutions in Iraq and Syrian institutions in Syria, and they are not capable of doing it right now. And that doesn't mean they can't be made to be capable of doing it. And some of our programs are designed to try to get them to that point. But the tough challenge is doing that while we're also running a military campaign and dealing with 1,000 other challenges.
Right.
We intend to try, and it'll be imperfect at best.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is a fundamental issue. There are lots of studies, lots of documentation that in countries where there's been a reconciliation process, which we want to see in Syria, which we want to see in Iraq, in countries where there has been some sort of peace process to tie a country back together after conflict, such as we see in Syria and Iraq right now, it won't last if there's not accountability. There will be a relapse into conflict. Whether it's the Yazidis who won't trust the system or whether it's something more broadly, there has to be accountability built in to whatever the solution is. It'll be tough to do, lack of capacity, things like that. But if it's not done, even if there is a temporary reprieve because ISIL's been defeated, all of the underlying ethno-religious problems that we've talked about will simply reemerge in another virulent form.
Anybody else want to weigh in?
Well, I would just add, I think the time frame that we're thinking about. I mean, I'm reminded that it was 2 months ago that Ratko Mladic was found guilty of genocide in Srebrenica, that an international criminal tribunal in Yugoslavia, which has been in existence for nearly 20 years, finally made that determination, right? And that in Cambodia right now, there is an extraordinary chamber which is trying officials from the Pol Pot regime 40 years ago. So when we think about the search for justice, it's a long search. And I think even prior to this idea that local officials are going to be held accountable for the crimes that they committed locally, I think we have to think much more about documenting these crimes now, because they are fresh, the graves are fresh, the memories are fresh, And if we do not do more to document what has happened, I mean, again, from our experiences in these camps, there is no closure. There can be no healing without closure. People have to know what happened to their loved ones. People have to know what happened to their cities and towns and villages. And unless we do more, we collectively do more, and I think the United States has a particularly important role to play in assisting with the documentation of the crimes that were committed, then it's going to be very difficult to have any kind of justice or accountability process whenever that might happen.
And just building on that a little bit, I would say as well, in addition to everything that my colleagues said here, the act of documentation is itself a first step in justice, not just because of the accountability question, but because the most unjust thing you can do to a person who has suffered what some of these people have suffered is to not acknowledge what has happened, for the stories not to be heard, for the persecutions and the losses that they have faced to go unacknowledged entirely. So the act of documentation itself is an act of justice in the kind of larger J sense of justice.
I guess I'd just add that, the act of accountability is very important. That Radovan Karadzic recently was finally sentenced by the tribunal for his acts in Bosnia years and years after the fact. That's important. And we talk here about accountability, and then in other quarters people talk about atrocities prevention and early warning. But we do need to think about that moment where things are beginning to become apparent and the political will necessary for action that lies in the spectrum between the post facto accountability and the diffuse efforts that people call for that are necessary for atrocities prevention. That moment of political will has to be an area of focus.
And what is the role of non-governmental organizations, concerned citizens, in pushing that forward or bringing pressure to bear on that moment?
Well, it's very important. I think we've seen a number of efforts, and hopefully our friend Samantha Power will write a new chapter in a revised edition of her famous book on genocide about how the United States is the most prominent voice against genocide in the world, and yet it still gets to the game late and formulates a position of national interest of somehow not getting there soon enough. There is an important role for civil society groups to raise this issue. Journalists and those who are documenting what are happening in real time are very important, because that's really what strikes home that something is not human rights abuses at the level that sadly exists all over the world, but something that it defined not by its scale but by its intent, as my colleague Cameron notes, that it's something special.
Tom, you told us about the struggle between the lawyers and the diplomats, perhaps, about making that genocide determination. Maybe talk a little bit as well about the effort on counterterrorism and how much priority that gets, sort of that military counterterrorism point versus human rights. Are those two things that are opposing, or are they, maybe at odds with each other, trying to get the attention and the priority, or can they work together?
Well, they shouldn't be at odds with each other, because
They
they're
shouldn't be,
actually
but are they?
one and the same. First of all, this situation shows us pretty clearly that counterterrorism is a human rights imperative. This is nowhere else in the world is it more clear that defeating a terrorist group is necessary to save the lives of innocent people and to protect human rights. But Mark is also right that the roots of this crisis all point to the imperative to hold our allies accountable before it's too late, in terms of, well, not just our allies, because Assad wasn't, but countries around the world, governments, accountable for human rights abuses, because this is what enabled Daesh to arise in the first place. It was filling a governance vacuum in Iraq that was caused by abusive and sectarian governance on the part of the previous Iraqi government, to the point where Sunnis in cities like Mosul when these crazy, foreign, mostly terrorists rolled into town. They were more afraid of their own government security forces in many cases than they were of the terrorists. And 2 or 3 weeks later, they realized too late that actually this was even worse. But at the critical moment, that was the judgment many people made. And then in Syria, of course, we can easily track the rise of ISIL and its ability to capture territory in parts of the country by pointing to the increasing escalation of terror on the part of the government of Syria against the people of Syria. So I think the lesson of this reinforces what we always say and often live by, which is that protection of human rights is a national security and counterterrorism imperative. And we do, I think I can say with great confidence, incorporate that lesson in the advice that we give to governments in the Middle East and the Horn of Africa and all over the world about the best way to deal with that problem. Yes, we do help them consistent with our laws that restrict security assistance on the basis of human rights. We do help them on the security side. But what we insist is that they're not going to be successful unless they govern in a way that builds trust with the communities where terrorists tried to exploit mistrust of governments to be able to infiltrate and dig in and gain adherence.
I just want to put a finer point on this distinction between counterterrorism and atrocity prevention, because we in beautiful theaters in Washington, we talk about it in the abstract. I want to sort of tell a story of someone who we spoke with in one of these camps whose wife was being held as a sexual slave along the Iraqi-Syrian border area by ISIS. His greatest concern was not that ISIS was going to kill his wife, but that his wife was going to be killed by an American drone attack going after her captors. And this is where the rubber meets the road on this issue. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about how do we pursue two, I think, competing objectives in a very narrow physical space. And I don't have an answer to that, and we didn't have an answer for this man who's speaking about a very real problem that he faces, and which many people face in this region right now. So I think that it's more than an academic discussion about how do we marry our values and our interests, which it of course is imperative that we marry our values and our interests with respect to our counterterrorism and our human rights and atrocity prevention policy. But there is a decision point that has to get made in the pursuit of both of those. That's very, very difficult.
Let me jump in there, because that's a very real operational concern. And I can tell you that we are doing everything humanly possible to track every shred of information that's out there about, for example, where captives are being held, where Daesh is maintaining prisons, and feeding that information to our military and to our partner militaries, because we absolutely do not want a situation in which the liberation causes the death of people who we are trying to liberate. And in fact, trying to build into the planning for when forces move on these places, the imperative to actually try to go to the places where the most vulnerable people are first. And in doing so, there will be failures and there will be mistakes. There's absolutely no question about that. And when we talk to Yezidis in northern Iraq, they understand that. They want us to go and liberate these areas. And at the same time, they want us to be as sensitive as possible to these concerns, and they feed us the information that we need. And I think that's the only way to go. It's also, by the way, one reason why this is taking longer than, say, it might have if we took a World War II approach to the liberation of this enemy territory and just sent the tanks and bombers in as we could, right? And, level Mosul in order to save it. So very real concern, but it's very high in our thinking.
Jeff, I'd be curious to hear from you from the UN international perspective, how significant you think it was that Secretary Kerry did indeed come to that determination that what is taking place is genocide, and what impact might that have beyond the declaration?
I think it is significant when a country as powerful as the United States, when a country that plays the leadership role that the United States plays in the United Nations and in the broader international community, is extremely important that happened. If nothing, it drew attention to what was happening. It focused people on in a way that UN documents should, but perhaps don't have the momentum behind them. So I think it was extremely important what the lawyers allowed Secretary Kerry to say. But from our perspective, on this whole issue, the accountability and the documentation we keep raising is really, really important. And the documentation, as Cameron says, is fresh. It needs to be gathered now to make this case stronger and to use for accountability later.
And several of you spoke about just the challenges of deeply divided, deeply hurt societies that have suffered so much. And whether we're talking about relocating back home or locating back home or relocating in these other areas, there's just so much pain, so much division. Susan, I know this is something you work on a lot in terms of peace building, and I'd like to hear more from your perspective about the role of local religious groups and civil communities to try to achieve that kind of situation. And please do share the story you shared with me backstage as well.
Thanks, Kim. At USIP, I do a lot of work with religious actors and religious communities and this kind of thing. And in addition to the lack of trust we've been talking a lot about the lack of trust with security actors, with the state, the need for policies and robust protection and accountability and so on, which is incredibly important. But then there's also the relationships, the human relationships, that you need to create that soil for peace to be able to take root. And there, I don't think that religious actors are a panacea, but I do think that they have a very important role in terms of leading their communities in efforts to both to respect and to see the other as human and someone with dignity, but also to raise up those somewhat theological, but also very deeply tied to our international notions of reconciliation, ideas of forgiveness and apology and confession and so on. The one story that I shared with Kim backstage and that I was going to share as well is the role that the Yezidi religious leaders have been playing, really taking the lead in welcoming back the women survivors, those especially who were raped, who were sexually enslaved, maybe who were impregnated as a result of this, which in some communities that can put a lot of stigma, including religious stigma, on those women that makes them vulnerable when they come back to their community, and particularly when that stigma becomes religionized, when they are not allowed into ritual spaces, when they are not allowed to participate in ritual activities as a result of that can create another form of violence, of spiritual violence against those women. The Yezidi culture is deeply conservative in some ways, socially conservative, and these kinds of stigmas against women who are impregnated but are not married can be live in these communities. But the Yezidi religious leaders have really taken a leading role in welcoming back these women and ensuring that they are welcomed back into sacred spaces, and providing religious rituals, and providing prayer, and providing care that allows them to, at least at a spiritual level, which emotional, psychological as well, to begin to restore their dignity and their rehabilitation. And I think in that way, they've also served as a model for a lot of religious leaders around the world who can play that role in restoring the dignity of women and girls who face that kind of suffering.
Thank you. That's great. I have a million more questions, but I've been given some that you all have as well. So we'll move into asking questions from the audience. A lot of these aren't specifically addressed to someone, so feel free to jump in or I may call on you. The first one says, from a historic lens, can we use anything we learned from the Holocaust to combat and prevent genocide? Cameron, is that
I'm guessing that
ready-made
one
for you?
might be for me. Well, listen, I mean, I think it's worth remembering that the entire sort of architecture, international legal architecture, not just of genocide prevention, but of refugees and the movement of people, it all stems from the immediate post-war period. And so that is the basis upon which we operate, the UN operates, and we as a signatory to these many conventions operate. I think the question that we face is, are those conventions, are those rules that were set up 70 years ago now, are they up to the challenge of a 21st century problem? Are they up to the challenge? Are they being stressed in ways today that the drafters of those documents couldn't have anticipated? Are they up to the challenge of the technologies and the world we live in and the enemy that we face? I mean, it's an open question. I think that the question that I raised about this non-state actor now committing genocide and having the ability to operate as a state, but not, again, it's not a signatory to any convention, ISIS. And so at the end of the day, Dick Holbrooke, God rest his soul, is not going to fly in and negotiate a peace treaty with ISIS. They're not going to be held in a conference room in New York or Geneva and negotiate a settlement. And so I think there's a question about whether or not those post-war institutions, how well they've weathered. Again, we haven't talked about it very much. 800,000 people displaced, but today we face 60 million people displaced around the world. It's the most number of people displaced since the Holocaust, right? And so it is not just atrocities being committed against religious minorities. It's a whole host of strains that I think the international system is grappling with right now, and we're using the bedrock that came out of the Holocaust. My belief is that they have weathered this challenge well, and they will continue to weather the challenge. But I think with respect to this specific situation and the lesson of the Holocaust, I think one of the stories that I recall, and we have this sort of testimony on our website, is by a guy named Jan Karski. Jan Karski was a Polish lawyer who actually was in the Warsaw Ghetto. He was witness to the crimes being committed. He was witness to the very first deportations to the concentration camps. He actually snuck in to the Warsaw Ghetto so he could view it for himself because he didn't believe it, and he got out. He made his way to Washington, D.C. in 1942, and he actually got a meeting in the Oval Office with Roosevelt, and he told him this entire story from beginning to end of the final solution and the plan for the Germans to destroy European Jewry. And Roosevelt's response, and it's this amazing story on our website, is that's why we have to win the war. Right? It wasn't a question of that's why we need to protect the Jews. And so I think it's a question that we have to ask ourselves, as we pursue the defeat of ISIS, as we pursue the defeat of whatever the terrorist target is there a separate imperative to protect people that are in harm's way? And I think that, in 1942, when you say, well, we're going to win the war and we're going to defeat the Nazis, and that's what's going to save the Jews, well, in fact, that's not what saved the Jews. Right? After 3 years additional killing, there were 6 million Jews that were dead and countless more. So I think it's a question that we have to ask whether or not we've effectively learned that, and I think this is a very open question right now in this case.
Mark, you have
Well, I'd just like to reiterate this. This is sort of on my mind. Freedom House is 75 years old. It was formed in 1941 on a bipartisan basis to try and get the United States into World War II. And, well, it helped that 9 weeks after Freedom House was formed, Pearl Harbor happened, but that did get us into World War II a little more easily. But, you know, there are two lessons from that era. You know, one is if you're in a moment of isolationist torpor, nativism and nationalism we see on both sides of the Atlantic now, you may not have the will to deal with a larger conflict. But then the second point, and that's how Yarn Karski is relevant here, is to recognize some conflict, which looks like a struggle against terrorism and so on, for having at its heart an atrocities element. Karski was trying to get British leaders and American leaders to recognize that, you know, the final solution was at the nub of this. So as I think of Freedom House, you know, which got named Freedom House because the Nazi headquarters was Brown House, at the heart, you know, is the atrocities question that comes from some particularly bloodthirsty autocracies or terrorist actors.
Jeff, did you want to weigh?
I'd like to go back to the question about whether all these conventions and charters and things that were signed at the post-war era are still relevant or not. You know, I was not working in the multilateral world before I joined the United Nations about 4 years ago, so that I don't have a long period of working in the international organizations part of the State Department. So the UN was new to me when I started my job up there. And when I look at the member state debates over you know, various resolutions, I think that the UN Charter is actually a miracle. I do not believe that we could have that type of charter, imperfect as it is, passed today with the diversity of member states that we have. And the charter has proven flexible enough to allow new tools. Peacekeeping doesn't appear anywhere in the charter. That's not there. But yet peacekeeping, there are now 130,000 peacekeepers deployed worldwide. You hear of some bad stories of a few, but it's basically a successful tool that has been developed within the parameters of the charter, but not mentioned in the charter. There are other examples of that. But where I think that member states, the UN as an organization, as well as member states of the United Nations, have failed, is putting the focus on the essential element of the charter, which is prevention. You know, the beginning of the charter talks about this organization to prevent succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Well, too often the UN is and again, it's a member state-based organization, so it's driven by the member states in the organization, but they respond to crisis. They respond to the fact that ISIS is committing atrocities in northern Iraq rather than being able to effectively prevent the conflict. The Security Council does not spend time thinking about what conflicts might arise. The Security Council responds to the conflicts that have arisen. So there is $8.5 billion a year spent on peacekeeping. There's $600, $700 million a year spent on like special envoys, special political missions. These are all for post-conflict or conflict situations. There's no identifiable money for conflict prevention in the UN budget.
Well, that leads directly into the next question that someone had addressed specifically to Tom, which was, if it's too late to, quote, do anything about genocide by the time we identify it, how can we improve our predictive and preventative methodologies, political, social, and economic, or better apply those methods already in place in the future, in the face of future genocide? And that was addressed to Tom.
I think we're not that bad at seeing these things. And what I was referring to was the legal determination of genocide, that by the time because the legal bar for declaring genocide is very, very high. It requires a particular form of evidence that takes time to gather and to analyze. It's very rare that you can get to the point where the legal experts will agree that you can use the term. And by that time, it's nearly always too late to do something. And I think that was the case, in Darfur. It already started in Bosnia and Rwanda. But that doesn't mean that we don't see what's happening. I mean, you see there are mass atrocities. You see that people are being killed. You see that people are being driven from their homes. The lawyers may not be ready yet to let you call it a certain name, but you see what's happening. And I think the challenge for us is it's always mustering the will and the resources to react ideally before you get to the atrocity stage. And if necessary, early in the atrocity stage, early enough to be able to do something about it. And it is challenging because if you think about what the indicators are present in a whole bunch of places in the world. You guys do a kind of a watch list where you try to identify in advance where some combination of poor governance and ethnic, religious, sectarian tensions, individual human rights abuses create circumstances in which mass atrocities are possible. And the reality is that if you list 30 places like that, probably 27 or 28 of them you're going to be wrong, hopefully, right?
Hopefully.
And it's impossible to know for sure which of those 30, which 2 or 3 are going to end up becoming a Rwanda or a Bosnia or what we're seeing now in northern Iraq and Syria. But when it begins, then it's a question of mustering the will. And we as a country are called upon to do this again and again and again, and we're tired of it, which is a normal and natural and actually very healthy human impulse. How many times do we need to go back to Iraq and the Middle East and try to solve these problems? That's what we are hearing from the American people. And it's completely understandable and again, very healthy. And yet, kind of going back to the lessons of the Holocaust, I think, the lesson is that when the genocidal impulse is unleashed, it is by definition an impulse that has no limits. And eventually, it leads to problems that draw us in. And so I think the wisdom that we have hopefully gained from all of this experience is that it is generally better to do something early than to be forced to do even more late.
I'm going to try to get a couple more questions in before our time is up. This person asks, what is your view on the role of U.S. educators in genocide response and prevention? Susan, you want to take that one?
Sure. I mean, well, we often say in the peace-building world that education is the heart of everything, that the integration of ideas of civic education, of peace-building, knowledge and practices, to use a trope that I keep using, creates the soil in which we can ensure that the next generation of leaders don't fall into the traps of sectarianism and ethnic prejudice and inability to govern effectively and inability to create institutions that respect human rights and pluralism and so on. So I think education is key in order to create a future in which genocide becomes less tenable. But it's a long-term solution.
This person notes that the negative perception of the Yezidi people is prevalent within many Muslim nations. What can be done to combat this? Would a PR campaign even be able to change centuries-old distrust?
Well, there are problems of groups just being seen as non-people, as being of less value. I remember, dialogue about the Balkans. The United States really stepped up when it came to Kosovo after the episode of Bosnia and Srebrenica. But you would hear people suggest that Albanian Kosovars were this sort of people you could jettison, that they are, you know, not worthy of the effort. And that's the problem, that certain, you know, groups are subject to being seen as disposable.
Yeah, well, this is all over the world and in all kinds of conflicts. One of the roots of the problem that people are seen collectively as a group and defined as the other. And whenever you have that under the surface, you will eventually find, there will eventually arise unscrupulous leaders who take advantage of those sentiments to foment violence and atrocities for their own interests. And you know, so many of the problems we face around the world are like that. But just to maybe add a hopeful note on this one, I think what's happened to the Yazidis has been so horrible and recognized as so horrible, including by most Muslims in the Middle East, that it has created an opportunity for them to begin to overcome some of that prejudice. There's a very courageous young Yezidi woman who was a survivor, who was a captive and a survivor, and who has told her story and testified at the UN and all over the world, and she's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by the government of Iraq. You know, the Shia Muslim-dominated government of Iraq, and by the Kurdish authorities, also largely Muslim, in Erbil. When I went to Iraq a couple of months ago, met with all kinds of communities, all of whom had suffered, including Sunnis, including Shia, from Daesh, and all of them said to me, you know, God, as bad as it was for us, it was worse for the Yazidis. And they wanted us to make the genocide determination. They wanted us to single the Yazidis out for the special suffering that they had faced. So it's too bad that this is what it took to get to that point of recognition, but I think that it has changed attitudes and perceptions among many Muslims in Iraq.
Jeff, did you have something very brief?
Very quickly. The Secretary General in January presented to the General Assembly, my prevention kick here, a plan on prevention of violent extremism, and talked a lot about these root causes, disenfranchisement, talking about the other, and how the governments have to address this at the national level, the community level. I was encouraged, the OIC summit that just took place, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, endorsed the Secretary General's plan of action to prevent violent extremism that included these elements, that you can't start describing the others. So there's the discussion at the international level among the leaders of Islamic countries is at least changing.
I'm told this is the last question and we only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to ask each of you to be very disciplined and maybe keep your answer to one sentence. We'll let everybody have a say on this. This person wants more specific examples of prevention projects on the ground and wants to know what specifically you would like to see on the ground to prevent future atrocities. So maybe just one sentence from each of you and we'll wrap up. Cameron?
So there's a lot of really interesting work going on in this field. I would cite one that I've seen in West Africa, a kind of local early warning system among sort of tribal and elder councils that exist, where it's a sort of ear to the ground of what's going on in local communities and very targeted local interventions to de-escalate tension, to de-escalate violence, and to bring in outside attention when it's required. This is a locally run initiative, and to the extent that it gets outside attention or intervention, it's at the national or even the regional level. But it's not, it's not from the UN, it's not from the United States being, directed from Washington. I don't think that we can have genocide prevention policy where the handle gets turned in Washington and the screw turns in, you name the place. That's very difficult to achieve. So the local systems are imperative.
Yep.
Women. To do conflict prevention successfully, you have to have women as part of the process, not simply a token woman at the table. They have to be brought in. There's data that shows this, that conflict resolution prevention that have included women at substantive elements at all levels, including implementation, tend to succeed. Others, there's a relapse.
There you go. Great. Tom?
Well, governments can't prevent a darn thing if they're not working with and building trust with community leaders, civil society, women included. You know, they're not going to know if something is coming, number one, if they don't have good communication with people living in the communities who see what's happening in their communities. And no one is going to call their government, their police force, their military to ask for help in these situations if there isn't that trust. And so everything we do to build that trust, from just basic promotion of respect for human rights to some of the programming that the State Department, the UN, and others sponsor to actually help facilitate dialogue and trust building between the state and its citizens, is vital.
Susan?
All of that, but I would also throw the religious spin on what Cameron was saying. I think religious institutions are actually really powerful networks for serving as early warning and early response, simply because of the fact that they're transnational, that they're in places where, rural places where the state and international actors might not have access to information or access to provide security. So seeing the ways in which we can use religious institutions to be able to draw on what's going on, and especially to be able to pick up on when there's religious narratives that are promoting prejudice and that are creating tensions, and then to be able to use religious networks and institutions as conveyor belts to bring that information out and to make it known both at the national level and at the international level, I think would be really powerful.
Freedom House does programmatic work all over the world. One of the places is Myanmar. We have a small operation there, and one of our projects is to work on religious pluralism. There have already been atrocities in the past in Myanmar. Things are headed slowly in the right direction in terms of governance in Myanmar. Our program is designed to try and get different groups of different religious identities to work together in a new society, and this is a place where even those most lauded for trying to bring about change, like Aung San Suu Kyi's NLD, don't typically look at the Rohingya Muslims like they're human beings.
Well, this is great. I'm sure we could keep talking for hours more, but we won't. Thank you for being such an attentive audience, and please join me in thanking our panel.